Hello and welcome to this new episode of the Eigen Values podcast. This is an audio version of the Eigen Values Substack that can be found at davidturver.substack.com. This time we look at a recent report about net zero from the Centre for Policy Studies and call for think tanks to start thinking again. If you enjoy this podcast, please like, share and subscribe to receive more content. We are blessed with a wide range of think tanks in this country that approach deep-seated societal problems from different political perspectives. In a democracy, it's important that we hear ideas from all colours of the political spectrum, even if we conclude that some of those ideas are barking mad and should be consigned to history as soon as possible. However, one subject where just about all the think tanks agree is net zero. They all think we should implement net zero, with the only argument being over the pace and the minutiae of policy details. But as John F. Kennedy said, when everyone is thinking alike, no one is thinking at all. It's therefore more in sorrow than anger that I've carried out this review of a new paper published by the Centre for Policy Studies. The CPS was founded by Sir Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher and styles itself as Britain's leading centre-right think tank. Without further ado, let's dig into the paper in question, which is called A Cheaper Route to Net Zero, authored by former Tory MP John Penrose. The paper puts forward 20 ideas that the author claims are low cost, will cut energy bills and boost investment. Penrose's biography on page 2 of the paper claims he campaigns for a small state supply side reforms so Britain's economy and society work for the many, not the few. I can think of no better supply-side reform than delivering cheap, abundant energy, which will assist many of the poorest in society. But as we shall see, this paper fails on almost every level. The main problem with the report is that it does not start from first principles and ask whether net zero is either necessary or desirable. The title of the report is an implicit acceptance that net zero is a good strategy, and with a bit more tinkering, we can make it palatable. But the inescapable truth is that intermittent renewables can never compete on level terms with hydrocarbons, so renewables will always need big state interventions to force them onto the market. This should be anathema to free market think tanks. With that in mind, we can now delve into the detailed recommendations in the report. Penrose begins with a call to decouple the gas price from electricity markets. Despite correctly identifying that energy bills for British households are not falling as fast as international gas prices, the report recommends that we rewire UK energy markets and stop using the short-term gas price as the benchmark for electricity prices. Penrose doesn't explain exactly how this should be done, nor the impact it would have. As a reminder, there are 3 types of renewables subsidy: renewables obligations, or ROCs, contracts for difference, or CFDs, and feed-in tariffs, or FITs. ROCs are the most expensive scheme, with the OBR forecasting a cost of about £7.9 billion this financial year. ROC-funded renewables receive certificates in addition to the market price they receive for the electricity they sell. Offshore wind generators receive about 1.9 certificates per megawatt hour of generation, with a value this financial year of £64.73 each. So the subsidy amounts to £123 per megawatt hour. It's not clear how cutting the link to natural gas prices would alter the market price they receive, but it would certainly do nothing to reduce the subsidy level. The OBR forecasts that CFD subsidies will cost us £2.3 billion this year. They also forecast these subsidies will rise to £3.1 billion by 2029 and 2030. CFD-funded renewables receive an index-linked fixed price for their output, regardless of the prevailing market price. If cutting the link to gas prices reduced the market reference price, then they would just receive more subsidy to top them up to the CFD strike price. So far this financial year, the average strike price for offshore wind has been about £150 per megawatt hour, compared to the market reference price of about £62. The reference price has been rising over the past couple of months to £75 per megawatt hour, driven by higher gas prices, but this is still well below the average strike price for offshore wind. FITs cost us about 1.7 billion in 2022-23, and these renewables receive an index-linked fixed price for the electricity generated, plus a small top-up for the amount exported. Decoupling the gas price from electricity markets will not change the amount these projects are paid. It's not clear how this decoupling will work, and even less clear how it would deliver lower bills. Penrose calls for future CFD contracts to be amended to use a wider range of longer-term reference prices. If those reference prices are lower, then CFD generators will receive more subsidy to top them up to the strike price. If they are higher, then CFD owners will receive less subsidy, but we will pay more for the non-renewable electricity. The report also calls for the government to stop offering CFDs to repower existing green energy generation, by which I think he means stop subsidising refurbishment of worn-out wind turbines and solar panels. Without subsidy and some sort of guaranteed price, these projects are unlikely to happen at all. Penrose's report then exhorts us to choose the cheapest green energy. The report calls for measures to address the challenges caused by intermittent renewables. This is one of the more sensible recommendations in the whole report. Penrose wants CFD auctions to be amended so that generators must promise to produce dispatchable power. This would mean that as well as building the wind turbine, they would need to build batteries or another form of storage to provide backup for when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. The challenge will be deciding the duration of the firm power being available. In winter, solar power produces only a tiny fraction of the output in summer months. Sizing a battery to provide year-round firm power will be prohibitively expensive. We often see periods of low wind for a week or more, so sizing a battery to provide backup for a week's worth of wind output will make these projects uneconomic too. Ironically, this recommendation for achieving net zero would likely stop new build renewables in their tracks. The next main element of the report calls for slashing of transmission costs. The report acknowledges that it's going to be enormously expensive to upgrade the grid to connect lots of remote renewables to the sources of demand. The most obvious way to reduce these costs is not to build so many remote renewables hundreds of miles away from the source of demand, and instead concentrate electricity generation on existing nuclear sites and place SMRs on old coal-fired power stations. But the Penrose report makes a set of recommendations that will not reduce the actual cost at all. He wants to introduce what he calls local pricing for energy transmission costs, effectively reducing prices for users who are close to the source of generation or storage. First, while this approach might reduce constraint costs a bit and introduce greater variability in the price of using transmission assets, it's far from certain that overall costs will come down. This is because the overall cost of new transmission lines still needs to be recovered, and it's unlikely this will outweigh the savings in constraint costs. Moreover, by adding more storage to the grid, overall system costs will rise because CapEx will be higher with no increase in output. Finally, it will be perverse to incentivize industry to move to some of the most beautiful landscapes on our coast, where the power lines make landfall from offshore wind farms. Penrose also wants to introduce local discounting to effectively bribe customers who live near new pylons or onshore wind farms, so they agree to them being built. Again, this will not reduce overall costs because the rest of us will have to pick up the bill for these local subsidies. The report also recommends that demand management measures are further developed so that penal prices are charged for using electricity at peak times. As we've discussed earlier, these time-of-use tariffs are simply another example of people being asked to run their lives around the needs of the grid rather than designing the grid to meet the needs of consumers. Penrose then makes a series of recommendations for cutting red tape. On the face of it, cutting red tape sounds like a good idea. The report waxes lyrical about off-gem sclerosis and the power of competition to bring down prices. The problem is the proposals for cutting red tape include adding 3 new obligations onto Ofgem and the other regulators without taking any obligations away. These recommendations are to introduce pro-competitive interventions, or PCIs, and give Ofgem the legal duty to publish red tape costs and give regulators a new duty to report on and minimise economic and regulatory costs. The report also recommends changing the price cap rules. It's very hard to see how adding 3 new obligations will reduce red tape or cut the cost of the bloated regulator. All new obligations do is add complexity and cost. Much better to get rid of things like the price cap altogether and cut down the size of the regulator. The final set of recommendations are an attempt to level the playing field for UK manufacturing by introducing what's called a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, to attempt to mitigate the impact of high energy prices. In other words, another set of regulations on top of all the other regulations we have governing the energy market. The idea that is if we tax the embedded carbon on imports, the UK manufacturers will be better able to compete with imports from countries like China that use cheap electricity generated from coal to produce their goods. It's interesting that introducing the idea of a CBAM implicitly accepts that green renewables are much more expensive than other forms of electricity generation. If renewables really were cheaper, then UK manufacturers would have a competitive advantage from cheaper energy. The whole idea of CBAM is spectacularly misguided. If energy prices are very expensive, then UK manufacturers are simply not going to be competitive on the world stage, even if they are exempt from the emissions trading scheme as recommended. Companies are simply going to relocate their operations to places where energy is cheap, and they can be globally competitive. CBAM, together with expensive energy, will likely accelerate deindustrialization. So as we conclude, what are we to make of all these recommendations? Well, as Dieter Helm said a couple of years ago, our energy markets are a mess. They're mired in a morass of complex, contradictory rules and regulations, some of which are designed to mitigate the impact of earlier interventions. For instance, we've introduced subsidies on renewables that make electricity more expensive, then added carbon taxes to gas-fired generation to level up prices, and then added energy-intensive industry support schemes to try and mitigate the impact of high prices. It's an expensive and self-destructive shambles, about as far away from free markets as it's possible to get. This new report will only make things worse. The root cause of all these problems is the ideological pursuit of net zero in defiance of common sense and economic reality. But instead of starting from first principles and challenging the whole idea of net zero, the Centre for Policy Studies and Penrose accept the premise of net zero and offer platitudinous ideas to attempt to mitigate the damage. Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher will be turning in their graves after seeing such intellectual weakness. It's time for our think tanks to start thinking again and challenge the whole idea of net zero from first principles. First, why is net zero even required? It's a manifestation of the mitigation strategy to combat climate change, but why is mitigation the best strategy? For mitigation to be effective, it requires CO2 to be the only influence on climate change, and for every other country to be reducing emissions to zero. Neither condition is being met, and the risks of the net zero cure are far higher than the supposed climate change disease. Yet, we're hurtling down the road to serfdom by pursuing policies that will halve per capita energy use by 2050. We already have the most expensive electricity in the IEA, and under current policies of carbon taxes, more intermittent expensive renewables, and massive extra spending on the grid, prices are heading even higher. The alternative is the adaptation strategy, where we focus first on cheap, abundant energy and take a chainsaw to the current regulations. Ideas would include repealing the Climate Change Act and abolishing the Climate Change Committee, eliminating carbon taxes, stopping subsidising new renewables, and find ways to mitigate the costs of the existing subsidy regimes. We could restart North Sea assets by re-allowing drilling and lift the moratorium on fracking to increase the supply of natural gas. We could slash off-gem red tape and get rid of the price cap. We should also overhaul nuclear regulation to cut costs and speed up delivery. And then we could invest in a fleet of new nuclear plants. If climate change becomes a problem, we could use some of our surplus energy to invest in adaptation measures like flood defences, and we could also invest in new crop varieties if the weather changes. These have the advantage of being effective regardless of what others do, and will undoubtedly be cheaper than destroying the economy. The problem we face is similar to the destructive power of the unions in the 1970s and 80s. But instead of tackling Red Robbo, we now need to face down the green blob. There's nothing intellectually difficult about this. It just requires courage and determination, like that shown by Thatcher at the time, using the intellectual framework provided by the CPS. The free market think tanks need to rise to the challenge and start thinking again. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel to receive more content, or sign up at davidturver.substack.com.